Okay, we'll start with this. Well, the numbers are in for Gervonta Davis's pay-per-view debut this past weekend per tweet from Mike Kopinger. Gervonta Davis versus Leo Santa Cruz Showtime pay-per-view is expected to generate between 200,000 and 225,000 pay-per-view buys. This exceeded expectations. Good showing for Tank, who is making his pay-per-view debut. With that viral KO, Davis should be able to build off of it. Now, this set of numbers is getting mixed reviews. Was the pay-per-view a financial success or a financial failure? In truth, based on these figures, it does appear that the event was a financial success, as the success of a given pay-per-view is based on what it costed to put together, what it costed the event coordinators to orchestrate the event.
What did it cost to put together?
And based on what it costed, how much money did the pay-per-view generate? How much money did it bring in? Because if it brought in less than what it costed to put together, the event is a financial failure. But if it brought in more than what it costed to put together, then the pay-per-view was a success. That being said, based on these figures, this set of pay-per-view buys, something to the tune of 200 to 225,000, and what numbers are floating out there in the boxing cosmos as far as how much money were both Leo Santa Cruz and Gervonta Davis guaranteed for this event, I'll tell you that based on these numbers, the event does look to have been a success, as the fighters weren't guaranteed all that much money to begin with. Gervonta Davis was only guaranteed something to the tune of $1 million, and Leo Santa Cruz was guaranteed a little more. He was guaranteed $1.5 million. So these guarantees to the fighters are not exorbitant guarantees that would take a lot of pay-per-view buys to clear, like what we saw in Wilder versus Fury 2, where both of those guys were guaranteed a reported $30 million apiece. In that situation, the fighters' guarantees were so exorbitant, so much in excess of their actual marquee value, that they weren't able to bring that kind of money back. In order to bring that kind of money back, they would have had to have sold 1.1 million pay-per-view buys, and that would have been just a break even. That's before you even start making money.
They didn't sell 1 million pay-per-views.
They definitely sold more pay-per-views with their second fight than they did with their first. The first time out, they only sold about 325,000 pay-per-view buys, whereas the second time out, they'd sold about 500 to 520,000 more pay-per-views than they did with the first fight, something to the tune of 800 to 850,000 pay-per-views sold.
Reportedly.
Substantially more than the first fight, though still not enough to break even. As I reiterate, the guaranteed purses to the fighters were well in excess of their actual marquee value, their market value, the money they can bring you back. In this situation with Gervonta Davis and Leo Santa Cruz, neither one of these two guys was guaranteed all that much money.
So there's not as much financial risk involved.
I mean, that's the look of it, that the break-even point for this pay-per-view would have had to have been substantially less than the break-even point for Wilder versus Fury 1 and 2, because neither one of these two guys were guaranteed as much as those guys were in either of their fights.
This was less.
So their break-even point was that much easier to hit, i.e., they didn't have to sell as many pay-per-views to break even with this thing as Wilder and Fury did with their pay-per-views. The event does look to have been a financial success when you look at the pay-per-view figures, and lest we forget, there was actually a live gate. There was actually an audience in attendance for this thing, just a little over 9,000 fight fans. So with what it generated on pay-per-view and what it generated at the live gate, it does look like they made some money off of this thing. And because they didn't risk much, they didn't guarantee these guys a whole lot of money. It doesn't look like it took a whole lot of money to put this thing together. It looks like they got some good profit margins off of this fight. So the event does look to have been a financial success, though there is still a question as to whether or not this means Gervonta Davis is a pay-per-view star. Is that what we're looking at, and is that what this is? Because this set of pay-per-view buys, financial success that it might have been, financial success that it may have yielded, really ain't a whole lot of pay-per-view buys.
It's not.
The only reason the event was a success was because they didn't risk much in putting it together. They didn't put up a whole lot of money for either of these two guys. That's why it was a success. I mean, 200,000 to 225,000 pay-per-view buys really ain't a lot of pay-per-view buys, you understand. That's substantially less than what Errol Spence Jr. and Mikey Garcia brought in with their pay-per-view debuts, and that is still less than what Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury brought in with their pay-per-view debuts.
That means less people bought Gervonta Davis's fight.
And that means less people saw Gervonta Davis's fight. fight. Are you really a star for selling 200 to 225,000 pay-per-view buys? Is that what that means? Is that what that is? You're a star.
I don't think so.
The event was a financial success, and it is a good start, but it's hard to believe that Gervonta Davis is the A-side, as it were, the A-side to anyone from 130 to 135 pounds when he wasn't even the A-side in this fight. Did you pay attention to the guaranteed purses to the fighters? Did you pay attention to what it says? A 50-50 split with Leo Santa Cruz.
That's what it says.
But if we're using this set of numbers as a barometer for whether or not this event was a financial flop or a financial success, if this is what we're using, we then have to acknowledge that Leo Santa Cruz was guaranteed more money than Gervonta Davis, and that these guys split the upside of the pay-per-view down the middle. It's a 50-50 split. So how could you be the A-side to a Teofimo Lopez or a Ryan Garcia, two fighters who are more popular than Leo Santa Cruz? How do you claim that you're the A-side over those fighters when you weren't even the A-side with Leo Santa Cruz?
You had to go Dutch with that guy.
And then going half and half with that guy. At most, what you brought back with 225,000 pay-per-view buys, a fight with Ryan Garcia or a fight with Teofimo Lopez, I'd wager, would bring in considerably more pay-per-view buys than what Gervonta Davis just brought in with Leo Santa Cruz. That being said, is Gervonta Davis really the A-side to these fighters? I don't think so. He sold 225,000 pay-per-view buys, the max. That's a generous estimate. That being said, selling 225,000 pay-per-views doesn't indicate a whole lot of star power. And if the event wasn't a financial flop, if it was a success, that has more to do with how you played it than Gervonta Davis' star power. He had to go half and half with Leo Santa Cruz just to bring in 225,000 pay-per-view buys. And you'll excuse me for saying so, but that doesn't translate into super stardom. That's essentially saying that Gervonta Davis may have debuted on pay-per-view before either Teofimo Lopez or Ryan Garcia, and in that way he sold more pay-per-views than either of those two guys ever have. That's true. But I don't know that that in and of itself makes him the A-side to those fighters. I don't see Teofimo Lopez bending over for a Gervonta Davis fight. Not that Gervonta Davis wants one or his team.
I don't think they do.
And better still, without Teofimo Lopez, without Ryan Garcia, without Devin Haney, without those kinds of top-tier, top-shelf opponents that will get a fight more attention than Leo Santa Cruz would, than Leo Santa Cruz did. Without those kinds of guys, how does Gervonta Davis cross over? How does he get involved in a super fight? Because if he don't fight Lopez, and he don't fight Garcia, and he don't fight Haney, there's only so much attention his fights are going to get. I mean, you won't get fighting Gary Russell Jr. what you'd get fighting Teofimo Lopez. You won't get fighting Gary Russell Jr. what you'd get fighting Ryan Garcia. You won't get fighting Gary Russell Jr. what you might get fighting Devin Haney. You just won't get the same attention, and Gary Russell Jr. in all likelihood is going to be Gervonta Davis's next opponent. I'm not even sure that fighting Gary Russell Jr. will get Gervonta Davis the same number of pay-per-view buys he just got fighting Leo Santa Cruz. Let me tell you something about A-side status. A-side status is getting the lion's share of the pot regardless of the size of the pot. For example, Canelo Alvarez has fought anyone from an unknown Englishman to an unknown Cuban to an overmatched welterweight. In every single one of those contests, not only did he bring in more pay-per-view buys than Gervonta Davis just did with Leo Santa Cruz, but he also got the lion's share of the pot. Never had to go half and half with any of those guys. Whereas here, what we see is that not only did Leo Santa Cruz get slightly more money than Gervonta Davis did guaranteed, but they split the upside of the pay-per-view down the middle. It was a 50-50 split. What that tells us is Gervonta Davis wasn't even the A-side with Leo Santa Cruz. So how could he be the A-side with a Ryan Garcia? How could he be the A-side with a Teofimo Lopez? It just doesn't make sense. We know that Floyd Mayweather Jr. quickly asserted A-side status in reference to a fight between his fighter, Gervonta Davis, and Teofimo Lopez, that Gervonta Davis would have to be the A-side in that fight. But based on the numbers, that doesn't look to be the case. And I've always interpreted that statement, those comments, as a means to prevent the Lopez people from even coming to the table, as they're fully aware what kind of games Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Gervonta Davis are playing. That being said, I don't expect any of those fights to come off anytime in the near future, if at all. I never have. But I do question how far Gervonta Davis can go, what heights his celebrity can reach when the most they can do for him is conjure up little guys like Leo Santa Cruz and Gary Russell Jr. for him to fight. I don't know that fighting those two little guys is going to cut it. In other news, per tweet from Michael Benson, Eddie Hearn has said he is not working with Joe Gallagher at present as a result of their recent dispute. We don't have a contractual obligation to get Callum Johnson out. I've got loads of fights for Callum, but right now I don't want to deal with Joe Gallagher. That being said, it appears that Eddie Hearn holds grudges. We saw what took place between Eddie and Kell Brook, the Sky Sports Matchroom. They didn't bother to pick up that upcoming Terrence Crawford fight as a result of Eddie being kept out of the loop. Here, as a result of Tesco Joe's inflammatory and damning comments about Eddie Hearn, about Matchroom and Sky Sports, Joe Gallagher's stable of guys and gals,
All them.
they're the ones suffering the consequences. What fighters out of Joe Gallagher's gym aren't Matchroom fighters, the ones that Matchroom has no fiduciary duty to promote.
Fighters like Callum Johnson.
Eddie Hearn has made it crystal clear that he's got no contractual obligation to that guy. He's under no obligation to get that guy fights or get that guy out of there. And you wonder how this is going to affect Callum Johnson moving forward. Moreover, you wonder how this is going to affect Natasha Jonas at a time where she's riding high, having put forth a very exemplary account of herself in a sensational performance with Terry Harper.
In their fight.
Does this affect a Harper rematch moving forward? That if Terry makes it past Katharina Thanders, given what's going on now between Tesco Joe and Fast Eddie, will Fast Eddie decide to forego that Harper versus Jonas rematch based on these comments, based on what's going on? I think that Eddie Hearn has reached his breaking point. It's hard enough to orchestrate situations, events, opportunities for fighters in this ongoing pandemic, but it doesn't help at all when a trainer like Joe Gallagher says the kind of things that he's saying. I think that Eddie has decided he's not going to put up with it because he doesn't have to. And Joe might have burned one bridge too many in saying what he said, because he's not going to find those kinds of opportunities for his stable of guys and gals with anybody else in the UK boxing scene. I don't view Frank Warren, Old Fish Eyes, and BT Sport as an equal to or greater than alternative to what exposure his stable of guys and girls would get on Matchroom, on Sky Sports. Really ain't the same thing. That, aside from Eddie Hearn, who else is offering up these kinds of opportunities right now?
But you want to badmouth that guy.
I mean, perhaps they can get Callum Smith out there because Callum Smith is a Matchroom fighter. I believe that Matchroom Boxing does have a fiduciary duty to that fighter, that active reigning world champion. But guys like Callum Johnson, guys like Natasha Jonas, where does this set of comments from Eddie Hearn, where does this set of comments leave them? Eddie Hearn is affording what are not Matchroom fighters the opportunity to fight on platforms, the same platforms as Matchroom fighters, on the Sky Sports platform, on the DAZN platform. And it seems like what Eddie Hearn is now saying is that if you think that you can do better, if I am this tyrant, if I am as unfair as you say I am, then you go out there and you do better. Because I'm not going to deal with you. I'm not going to put up with you. You go out there and you find somebody else that's affording you the opportunities that I am. Because you're going to have to. And finally, just in keeping with the theme of all things Matchroom, per tweet from Michael Benson, Eddie Hearn has now indicated that Dillian Whyte is not going to face a replacement opponent and will instead just wait for the rescheduled Alexander Povetkin rematch on January 30th. Conor Benn versus Sebastian Formella likely to headline a non-pay-per-view card on November 21st. And just in keeping with the theme of Dillian Whyte news, what we can expect to see on that card, Josh Kelly versus David Avanesian is now being planned as the chief support to the Povetkin versus Whyte rematch on January 30th, according to Eddie Hearn. That would be Josh Kelly's long-awaited step-up fight, a fight that some people think he won't make it through with his O intact, as David Avanesian is a rough-and-tumble kind of fighter, an experienced guy that could be a handful for Josh Kelly. This news, it comes as no surprise to me. I wasn't expecting Dillian Whyte to face a replacement opponent to save the date, as the whole point in fighting Alexander Povetkin for a second time is to reclaim his interim status so he can get back in line for a shot at the WBC title. And fighting anyone other than Alexander Povetkin is no substitute. It's not going to get you there, and it's not going to get you that. I'm not shocked at all that Dillian Whyte rather wait until January than fight again this year. I think it's important to note that the people over there at Matchroom, among several others in the sport of boxing, have figured out a way to function, have figured out a way to stage fights, put on fights, keep the fighters fighting throughout this global pandemic. Because right now, there are rumors of a second lockdown hitting the United Kingdom. The situation with the global pandemic really isn't over. The crowds, they may not be back yet in January of next year, but even if they're not, the groundwork has already been laid this year to still stage fights, still stage cards in their absence.
And that's what's important.
When the pandemic first hit earlier this year, it left the boxing community, the industry, at a standstill. Everything came to a screeching halt. And as this pandemic rages on, the powers that be have found ways to function, experimenting and refining methods to bring boxing back to the boxing fans that, for a time, many of us might be trapped at home with very little to do. But the show must go on, and the show will go on for the sport of boxing. The work done in 2020 ensures that the boxing fans won't miss the boxing matches in 2021. Pandemic or no pandemic, Whyte versus Povetkin 2 is the kind of intriguing matchup that you won't miss out on because they figured out the modus operandi to still deliver that fight with or without an audience. I don't even know what Dillian Whyte's chances are in that fight. A lot of people are picking him to lose. But whatever happens, it's a fight that we won't miss. And that is the silver lining here.